Hello, welcome everybody. Welcome to our lunch lecture, Amazigh Women's Arts, Visual Expressions of Berber Identity, that is devoted to a very particular subject of African art that is rarely associated with it. I'm very much delighted to introduce Professor Cynthia Becker from Boston University to you, who today will speak about these female artists of what she calls the Amazigh, and which we commonly know as Berber people in northwestern Africa, specifically Morocco, Algeria, and Niger. Cynthia Becker is Associate Professor in the History of Art and Architecture Department at Boston University and is a scholar of African and African diaspora arts, specializing in the arts of the Amazigh Berbers in northwestern Africa. Her book, Amazigh Arts in Morocco, Women Shaping Berber Identity, was published by the University of Texas Press in July of 2006 and is basically a handbook in the field. Professor Becker has consulted for numerous museum exhibitions on that subject and published articles on the visual and performing arts of the Amazigh. She is co-author of Desert Jewels, Jewelry and Photography from the Javier Heron Hermes collection, and most recently wrote an extensive essays for the catalogue of the exhibition Berber Women of Morocco, which took place for an exhibition that took place in Paris at the Yves Saint Laurent Foundation in 2014. At the moment, she is finishing a book about the Afro-Islamic aesthetics and ceremonial practices of the Nawa, which are descendants of former slaves in Morocco that consider visual representations of blackness and constructions of racial ideologies by and in relation to the descendants of these enslaved Africans in Morocco. We have invited her for this lecture not only to celebrate the reopening of the African galleries, but also to highlight the recent acquisition of 7 magnificent Berber textiles we were able to make last year. The gallery already owned a small but beautiful collection of urban North African textiles donated by Mrs. William Moore in the late 1930s, and which we now were able to complement with some great examples of Berber textile art. One example of each is represented in a new installation if you want to go and look at them after the lecture. Textiles play a crucial role in the arts of the Amazigh, and women are the main producers of it. A Moroccan proverb that Professor Becker quotes in her book is very telling in this respect, and I quote, "A woman who weaves 40 carpets is guaranteed a place in heaven," end of quote. Professor Becker's lecture today is the first event to introduce a rich program relating to African art over the next month. Next Thursday evening, Professor Herbert Cole from California will speak about the astonishing richness of Igbo art, Beauty's Beast, and others. Please take the special program card with you for information when you go out if you want to know more about the programming. But now please join me in welcoming Cynthia Becker. And just for your information, the lecture takes about 50 minutes and then there is room for questions. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Barbara, for inviting me. It's really wonderful to be here. There are so many familiar faces and people I know in the audience that it feels like I'm coming home, even though I've never been here before. So it's really wonderful. I'm going to start right away with an image. And I first began to study in Morocco in 1993, and I was introduced to wedding ceremonies that I attended in the rural southeast. And I loved going. I loved the atmosphere. There would be elderly women surrounding a bride who you see here wearing a red headdress. And they would sing songs in honor of the bride, in support of the bride. And one of her female relatives is the one who would dress her in a red headdress, the white dress that she's wearing, silver jewelry, amber jewelry. And I would later... the bride, I would go with them to the groom's house where the actual 3-day wedding ceremony would be held. But on the final day of the wedding ceremony, all the wedding guests, crowded around the bride as her head veil was lifted. So her head had remained covered this entire ceremony. Everyone scrambled to catch a glimpse of her face painted with saffron. So, as to be expected, the style of dress and jewelry worn by a bride differed greatly from women's daily apparel, which you can see by the two women wearing the black head covering surrounding her. But what really intrigued me is how little wedding dress had changed over the years. So there's a group of photographs that were taken by a French photographer named Mireille Morin-Bard in the 1950s. And when I compared those photographs to the ones that I had taken in the mid-1990s, you could really see the similarities. So if you look at the photograph on the left, the second woman from the left, whose headdress sort of projects out from the side, this is a bride. And you can compare her, she's wearing almost the exact same clothing as the bride in my photograph, except the bride in my photograph would have that same headdress, but it's covered with a white cloth. So I started to ask, why did bridal dress remain the same, where women's daily dress has changed greatly? And so the woman to the left on the photo from the 1950s, this would be the way that she would be dressing almost every day, indicating that she was a married woman. So she has the amber jewelry and the silver bracelets. But so the daily dress had greatly altered over time. So it's only during weddings that Amazigh women continue to dress as their ancestors. So an Amazigh groom is also covered, and you can't see his face except for his eyes, but he's wearing a hooded cape. It's called a silham. It's obviously white. And underneath that cape, he has a red belt that's wrapped around his face. He also has a red belt that's draped across his chest. Now, these are women's belts. And at the end of the belt draped across his chest is a woman's silver bracelet. It may not be so obvious in this photograph. So he's typically wearing dress that you would find throughout Morocco. What really makes it unique is the women's clothing that has been added to his body. So this told me that men are very reliant on women for creating symbols of identity. So after the bride arrives at her husband's house, before her face is revealed, she sits in public in a large tent that's constructed for the wedding. And men sat at her feet and sang songs in her honor. She sometimes got up and did a group dance with people. And I rarely saw the groom. He only became public on a couple of occasions during the wedding. So, so the bride was the central figure. So as we'll see, wedding arts convey the importance of womanhood in Amazigh societies. Women, especially mothers, are highly esteemed, and Amazigh women incorporate symbols and colors related to fertility into their textiles, their clothing. We'll look at some tattoos, their hairstyles, as expressions of female agency. So Amazigh women largely control ceremonial life. Rituals that reinforce family, social bonds. And throughout this lecture, we'll see that the visual arts worn and created by Amazigh women, they foster communal values, and they bring women a great deal of respect and self-esteem. They also serve as identity symbols. And this is really important in Northern Africa, where Amazigh people are often seen as a minority population that lives outside of the urban centers of power. So to situate you a little bit, this map shows you where Amazigh people live across Northern Africa. Every place you see that it's shaded with the dark color is where they live. So from Egypt in the east, all the way to Morocco in the west, where you have the largest Amazigh population. It's estimated between 40 and 60% of Morocco's population of 31 million are Amazigh people. And also in the Sahara, where they're popularly called the Tuareg. So although Arabs arrived in North Africa as early as the 7th century, it wasn't really until the 13th century that the majority of Amazigh people adopted Islam. Some learned the Arabic language and were assimilated into Arab culture. Yet many continued to speak their own languages. referred to collectively as Tamazirt, and they maintained cultural autonomy. After independence from colonization in the mid-20th century, North African countries, they identified themselves as Arab Islamic states. So Arabic was the official languages for Morocco, for Algeria, Tunisia, and Amazigh identity was often oppressed or completely written out of national history. Many Amazigh people felt politically, socially, and economically marginalized by their national governments, and there was an Amazigh activist movement that began during this post-colonial period. So a common term that's used, as Barbara mentioned, is Berber, and instead of Amazigh. And many activists actually reject this word because it's a term that was given to them by others. Berber derives from the Roman word barbaros, meaning barbarian. So who wants to be called a barbarian, right? So the Romans referred to anyone who didn't speak Latin as a barbarian. So this term was also adopted by others, and it became a common trope that was used by Europeans during the colonial period. So the last few decades, Amazigh activists, they started to stress that they would like to be renamed and called Imazigh, which means the free people in Tamazirt, the local language, or Amazigh, which is the singular term or the adjectival term. Or often people will call themselves by the name of their particular group. So often you'll hear people say, I'm Ait Ata. Ait means people of, and Ata would be the name of the founding ancestor of the group. So since I began to study Amazigh art, I've come to recognize that there are indeed certain stylistic and symbolic features that link Amazigh communities across northern Africa, revealing to me their great history in the area. Hand-coiled ceramics, such as this, were commonly made by women from the Rif Mountains in northwestern Morocco to the Tunisian island of Jerba in the east. Women worked local clay from spring to autumn when the weather was hot and dry. And after building the vessel form from a series of coils, a pot would be hardened in the sun, and then it would be smoothed and polished by a woman with a pebble. Women then added slip to the hardened clay, dividing the surface into distinct sections with red and white as the dominant colors, and then adding detailed geometric patterns in black. And then women fired the pots in pits. And in the Kabyle region of Algeria, where this particular ceramic vessel comes from, women added pine resin to the surface while they were still warm, which resulted in a characteristic yellow sheen. So this oil lamp would have been used during a wedding procession and placed in a matrimonial chamber for protection against harmful forces and also to enhance fertility. So as early as the 1970s, there was a thriving tourist industry that centered on the 1870s. There was a thriving tourist industry in the Kabyle area, and that's when this was probably collected during this early period. Women made pottery specifically for the tourist market. So increased contact with France during this period, this is the French colonial period in Algeria, resulted in imported goods made out of metal and glass being imported into the area, which replaced a lot of the ceramic vessels that women were making for their own households. So what's really interesting, I think, about this particular ceramic oil lamp is that it resembles a Jewish menorah, which are also used to burn candles or oil. And there's no denying that the form and function of Kabyle pottery was influenced by trans-Mediterranean contact, including contact with North Africa's Jewish population. So the history of Amazigh and Jewish people is deeply intertwined. Jewish artisans worked as silversmiths and made jewelry for their Amazigh clients. Typically referred to in English by the Latin term fibula, they consisted of a pin and a pendant joined by a chain. Fibula pinned the size of a woman's garment that would be draped around her body, and later I'll show you many images that show you exactly how women would be using fibula. But locally, this particular style of fibula was called tizerzeh and tauka, which means fibula of worms. So where does the worms come from? Worms come from the technique that is used to decorate the surface of the triangular shaped pendant here. So what the jeweler would do is that he would melt small circles of silver onto the surface of the triangular part of this after it was manufactured, so that the surface looked like a series of worms. So that's sort of creating this lace-like pattern, and so that's where the name comes from. And we know that many Jewish silversmiths were itinerant. They moved from area to area, bringing their jewelry making techniques with them. And one of the things that's really interesting about Amazigh jewelry is that while you find the same forms existing all over northern Africa, each region has its own particular style. For example, Ait Ata women in southern Morocco, they wore a fibula that consisted of the two main elements, the pendant as well as the chain that links them. And the pendants in the case of southern Morocco were typically made with mold, so pouring the metal into the mold itself. And the surface is not decorated with the worm technique. And so we know that Moroccan men would purchase this jewelry for their wives, and we don't know who commissioned the shape, the style, the size, and was it the client? Was it the artisan who decided? How did these regional styles develop? So this information has been lost over time since fibula are no longer made. And this is largely due to the migration of most of Morocco's Jewish population for Israel or for Europe, which occurred between 1948 and 1967. So this movement of people out of Morocco contributed to the decline of the jewelry industry. Differentiating between Amazigh and Jewish material culture is often difficult in North Africa, as you can see from this photograph. So this is a photograph that was taken by a French traveler to North Africa, Jean Besancenot, who took many wonderful photos between 1934 and 1939. And he labeled it as a Jewish woman from the Dra Valley, which is far in the southern part of Morocco. So she's wearing the same fibula that you would see an Amazigh woman wearing. So why do you see these similarities? The scholar Labelle Prussin asserts that Jewish artisans who made silver jewelry for their Amazigh clients influenced their forms. She argues that Jewish silversmiths borrowed from a visual resource bank that was inspired by Kabbalistic thought. And she says that they expressed aspects of numerology by using circles, spirals, and triangles, as well as squares in their jewelry. Now, since Jewish communities existed in North Africa since at least 70 CE, or maybe even earlier, Jewish communities often spoke Tamazight, and it's unknown whether indigenous Amazigh historically converted to Judaism, or whether Jews who were moving into North Africa from elsewhere were acculturated and adopted the Amazigh language and culture. But some probably eventually converted to Islam. We just don't really have that early history. So there are many gaps in the historical record concerning the history of jewelry. But at the same time that Jewish artisans left Morocco, many jewelry forms faded from fashion, besides not just because they left, but they became unfashionable. Sometimes the introduction of school system, young girls wanting to be educated, they're not wanting to wear the heavy silver jewelry of the past anymore. People started to sell it off. But sometimes you find old photographs like this. I don't know the photographer here, but this is from around the 1960s. And we can see she's wearing the classic jewelry kit that we associate with Amazigh women. So she's wearing the fibula, and she's also wearing a really wonderful amber necklace. So women valued amber for its medicinal and decorative qualities. But amber was so expensive that we know that only the wealthiest women could afford to buy it. So necklaces like you see here, the amber would be imported from the Balkans, or copal, which is amber that's just not quite as old, would have been traded up from West Africa. Also, sometimes reconstituted amber, so amber that had been crushed and then formed into balls, it's called ambroid, that was sometimes used. or Europeans realized there was a market for fake amber in North Africa, and they started to make beads from bakelite or casein and traded them in. So really only the wealthiest could afford amber, and there's a lot of imitation amber that's being worn. So, but we do know that amber necklaces such as this were given to women upon her marriage to mark her status. In addition, women in southern Morocco, where this photo was taken, as you can see, they wore these really stunning silver bracelets called izbin nikoroin, which means bracelets of animal horns. So each of these heavy bracelets has 12 triangular shaped points that radiate from its central band. So these were worn in pairs, as you can see. There's the one with the points, izbin nikoroin, and then there's another one called izbin masmod, which means smooth bracelet. So between the two, a woman wore a leather band so that the two didn't pit together and pinch her skin, and she would wear these all the time. Everything she did, grinding grain, collecting firewood, spinning wool, as you see in this photograph here, to mark her status as a married woman. These bracelets also tell us something about the role of women in Amazigh societies and what was ideal beauty in Amazigh societies. Women were expected to have the desired qualities of physical strength and endurance, somewhat hardy, right, working, they're living rural lifestyles. And so I think this jewelry also reflects that. So jewelry from the Kabyle region of Algeria, it's very different, a different style, but we still see the same jewelry kit of the bracelets, the fibula. But in the Kabyle region of Algeria, we see that enameled patterns decorated the surface of silver jewelry worn by women. In the late 19th century, when this bracelet was made, enameling was only practiced in a few areas of northern Africa. So the areas in the 19th century we know that maintained this enameling tradition were the Anti-Atlas region in southwestern Morocco, the island of Djerba in Tunisia, and the Kabyle Mountains, where this piece comes from in Algeria. And it's difficult to historicize the origins of enameling. And some scholars say that it was Jewish and Muslim refugees from Andalusia in Spain who carried the technique into North Africa in the 15th century when they fled from Spain. Others believe that maybe it was the Vandals in the 6th century who moved into North Africa who brought the enameling technique with them. And the reason it's only maintained in a few areas is because these areas are very remote, and one's an island, the other two are mountainous areas, and this is why this particular jewelry form had been preserved over time, where other areas were less pristine. So unlike other regions of northern Africa, Muslim rather than Jewish silversmiths dominated jewelry production in the Kabyle area of Itieni, which is where this comes from. So Itieni is a region in the larger Kabyle Mountains of Algeria. And Itieni is still famous today for the manufacturing of jewelry, and there's a jewelry festival that's held there every year. So it's a tradition that has been maintained into the present. So Kabyle artisans would have made fibulas such as this from melting down silver coins, and sometimes they melted down older pieces of jewelry or sometimes scrap metal. So if you actually look at the silver content of a lot of these pieces, it's not very high. It's definitely a mixed metal. So artisans would hammer the metal into various forms, and they created surface patterns by soldering twisted wires to the surface, forming closed-in spaces where blue, green, and yellow enamel, as well as coral, could be placed. Enameled patterns varied from village to village, so you can recognize which particular village a piece comes from by looking at the way the enamel was combined. And also, we know that coral was used, also imitation coral was used. This piece actually has real coral, but I've seen pieces in other collections here in the US and elsewhere where there's actually plastic used rather than coral. So the client would decide, how much money do I want to spend on a particular piece of jewelry? Do I want plastic? Or sometimes, interestingly enough, the jeweler would actually pound marble or gypsum and then add red dye to it, use glue made from fish to hold the piece together to make fake-looking coral that was then inserted into the piece of jewelry. So lots of techniques. So you can decide what you want depending on how much you want to spend. So a young woman in the Kabyle area then would have received fibula, just like in Morocco, the bracelets, a headpiece, and other forms of jewelry on the occasion of her marriage. And these would be purchased by her parents, so they would use the money given to her by her groom, her dowry, to purchase this jewelry. So this photograph shows you a whole group of people wearing Kabyle jewelry, but I believe that it's staged because you see little children wearing jewelry, which is typically only worn by married women. So I think they must have just gathered jewelry and have people pose while wearing it. So this photograph was donated to Harvard by a Boston-based businessman who traveled to Algeria in 1902. So at this point, as I mentioned earlier, this region had been impacted heavily by French occupation that began in 1857. In 1871, there was a revolt in the Kabyle area against French colonization, and the French put it down and established an administrative center in the Kabyle area to watch what was going on. And at this point, when that happened, tourism just flourished, and people flooded in, and the local people were very much suffering because of this colonial policy, so most of their land was taken away from them, and so there was high famine in the area, and people sold the jewelry that they originally had purchased for themselves to tourists who were coming in. And then, of course, jewelers are starting to make, even in the 1870s, for this tourist market. In fact, I found a document that dated to 1883 that was written by a British traveler to the Kabyle area. And she wrote that she really wanted to buy Algerian Kabyle jewelry, but she couldn't find anything in the market. It had all been bought up already. So, so while things are being sold off in Algeria, and we see that jewelry making sort of faded from fashion within Morocco, what has really flourished in Morocco, though, are textiles and the textile industry. So this is a photo that is from Marrakesh, and this is a shop that has many different textiles from all different regions that are being sold. We can see woven carpets, shawls, capes. Some of them are older pieces, some are new because women continue to make for the market. So women in Morocco, they weave on vertically mounted looms to make a variety of textiles, some for personal use, some to be sold. And the origin of this loom, it remains unknown, but most scholars believe that this type of loom circulated in the Mediterranean during antiquity. So there are similarities in Amazigh weavings from Tunisia to Morocco that we attribute to the portability and the versatility of the vertical loom used by women. So if you look at it, just made from some wooden beams that could be easily taken apart, placed on your back, and transported around, right? So this woman actually, when she created her loom, she added some metal posts that run vertically. And so this is done because she is making for an export market, and so she works all the time, and so she wanted to have a little bit more of a sturdy loom. She wasn't planning on moving it. But women often, so we think that, people picked up the loom and moved it around, and this caused a spread in a very similar textile style across northern Africa. So wool working includes washing, combing, spinning wool into thread. And synthetic dyes have been used in Morocco since the late 19th century. But prior to this, women hand-spun wool, and they dyed it with items such as saffron, indigo, henna, turmeric, and other natural materials. So women use a flat woven technique that includes inserting the weft threads horizontally through the warps that are held apart by a heddle rod and a shed stick. And as you can see here, women use a small iron comb with a wooden handle to pound the weft into place. So in addition to flat woven textiles, Amazigh women often weave knotted carpets as well, but they're really well known for their flat woven textiles. So this is an image that actually took last summer, and we see a woman who is using synthetic fabrics rather than wool. She's making something called a boucharouette. So this is almost like a rag rug that's made from discarded secondhand fabric. And this has been very popular recently, and many people have been collecting these in recent years. Largely, they started to be created by women because of desertification. The climate is changing. It's really difficult for people to have large herds of sheep. And because of this, women were finding textiles in the market and shredding them and using them to make carpets. But regardless of the material that's used to fabricate a carpet, there's a great deal of symbolic meaning that surrounds the loom. Women are said to metaphorically give life to a textile, and when the warp threads are attached to the loom, the textile is said to be born and have a soul. Some Amazigh weavers physically straddle the warp threads before the loom is even raised, so symbolizing the metaphorical birth of the textile. The textile then moves through youth, maturity, and old age as it's woven. And then when a woman cuts the textile from the loom, she actually splashes water on it, a little bit, and she says a prayer, much like someone would pray for a deceased person and wash the body of a dead person. So the personification of the textile underlies a woman's reproductive and creative powers. And by equating textiles with humans passing through the life cycle, it reinforces the centrality of women's art to Amazigh societies. So in the past, women created hand-woven shawls for themselves. Specific styles varied from region to region, but typically they featured intricate geometric patterns. They would have 2 cords of heavy wool attached to one of the long sides so that the textile could actually be draped over a woman's shoulders. So the textile on the left, which is from Yale University Art Gallery, it's missing those pieces that you would attach so that you could wear it over your shoulders, but it would be worn in the same way as you see in the photograph to the right. And in the left, the weaver used cotton thread to create geometric patterns that you see. And cotton was often used because it enhanced the textile's decorative qualities. But women really prefer to work in wool. And if you can, this is what you use, because wool has baraka. The word baraka in Arabic is divine blessings. And some of the baraka of the wool is then transferred to the weavers themselves. So as Berber said, a woman who weaves 40 carpets during her lifetime is said to be guaranteed a place in heaven. She receives a great deal of blessing and is very much respected within a local community because of her weaving abilities. So this particular woven head shawl from Matmata in southern Tunisia includes weaving as well as embroidery. So embroidery is also an art form that linked people across northern Africa. So this consists of red and yellow circular tie-dye patterns at the bottom. And then the rest is a solid woven indigo background, dyed with indigo. There's embroidery at one end that would have been done by a specialist, either an Amazigh woman or sometimes a Jewish tailor would do this. And this would have made this textile a very special piece, adding the embroidery to one end. So it would be worn during very important occasions, such as weddings. So several aspects of the head shawl that you see here, this is from a town in southern Tunisia called Matmata. Interestingly enough, Matmata was where Star Wars was filmed, the very first Star Wars in Tunisia. So, in fact, many of the types of textiles that are shown are based on textiles from North Africa that many of the characters in the film wear. So this technique is from Matmata. It's a very remote area of southern Tunisia. And the reason I bring this up is because tie-dye probably suggests a connection to West Africa. And you don't see so much tie-dye further north. It's very much a southern practice. So tie-dye is done in Sierra Leone, all the way to Nigeria. And the existence of this technique on both sides of the Sahara suggests a historical connection between these two regions. So, and what's really interesting too is that this technique probably moved from West Africa into North Africa. So this is an unusual thing. Most of the time when we look at art from the African continent, we often think of the influence of North Africa on South. So the influence is moving north to south, but here's an example of an influence from south to north. So the embroidery that we saw on the upper piece of the Tunisian head shawl resembles embroidery that's found elsewhere in northern Africa. In southeastern Morocco, for example, like you see on the right. This particular type of head covering was started to be woven or made by women in the 1970s because brightly colored yarn became readily available in the local market. So initially, women in the southeast of Morocco, they would have woven solid colored shawls for themselves and dyed them with indigo. But in the 70s, when this yarn became more available, this is also a time when imported fabrics became more available, polyester, cotton, and so women started to buy this fabric in the market and embroider it with the designs like you see here. So regardless of the introduction of new materials into southern Morocco, the style of embroidery you can see in both examples shares a lot of similarities. In both cases, women treated the textile itself as an empty canvas, and they used a running stitch to embroider designs. Both Moroccan and Tunisian royal embroidery featured figurative symbols such as stylized plants, repeating triangles, and even five-fingered hands. So you can see very clearly on the right that there's a hand here and there's a hand here. What's a little less obvious is right up here in the Tunisian example. There are hand-like motifs, a little bit more stylized than what you find in Morocco, but they are there. And the hand is very significant. 5 is an auspicious number because there are 5 obligations of Islam, and Muslims pray 5 times a day. Therefore, these motifs protect against the evil eye. So the evil eye, probably most of you are aware, is this idea that a look or a glance accompanied by a compliment hides feelings of envy and jealousy. And so if you compliment someone, you can actually harm that person because secretly you're envious of what they have. And the evil eye can cause bad luck, illness, and even death. And women may embroider or weave motifs to absorb the harmful effects of this negative gaze. Other motifs and colors used to embroider on textiles across North Africa include this particular textile that you see in the Siwa Oasis. This is from Egypt, southern Egypt. This is an oasis where people actually speak a Tamazight language. And women on their wedding days, they wear gowns like this, where the opening of the gown, you can see it has a series of 7 different squares going around the V-shaped opening, right? And then there's a series of embroidered patterns that radiate out from the opening of the neckline. 7 is a very important mystical number in Islam. When people go to Mecca, they circle the Kaaba 7 times, and heaven is said to have 7 gates. And when the Prophet Muhammad took a night journey to heaven, it's said that he crossed 7 layers of heaven to reach God. So it's definitely a reference to Islam, and people in the Siwa Oasis are Muslim. But there's also a reference to Amazigh heritage and this connection that you see across various areas of North Africa, because we see also the addition of mother of pearl buttons here. So the whole thing would sort of shimmer in the light. And there have been a lot of scholars who've written about these textiles, and they say that it shows the influence of a sun-worshipping cult based on, that goes back to pharaonic times. So there is a sun temple in the Siwa Oasis dedicated to the god Amon-Re. It's not used anymore, obviously. And I think it's very problematic to assume that people have kept the same religion and its influence, worshiping a sun god has influenced textiles that they make today. So it would mean that this common visual culture has existed for 2,000 years. While this may be the case, I do also think that these colors, the designs, you do see the influence of Islam, and you also see references to female fertility. And I think that's the most important aspect of these particular textiles. So Amazigh women across northern Africa, they use, like I said, the same designs and also the same colors when they do embroidery. Amazigh women commonly use black, yellow, orange, red, and green when they weave their carpets, also in the embroidery, and then also when they paint leather bags like you see on the left. So rather than see these colors as evidence of an ancient sun-worshipping cult, these colors are better analyzed as evoking fertility and prosperity. And in fact, in the Siwa Oasis, women compare these colors that they use in embroidery to ripening dates. So dates ripening on a palm tree. And I've heard the same exact thing in southern Morocco when I was doing work there. So, and you can make an analogy between ripening dates on a tree and the blossoming of a young girl into a woman. So the association of these colors with female fertility is also demonstrated by their being worn by Amazigh brides during wedding ceremonies throughout northern Africa. These pictures are from the southeast, but I could be showing you any place. And you can see that they're wearing red headdresses. The amber is a yellow or orange color. There is a black cloth on her back. The textile here is red, yellow, green. She has green tassels. So all of those colors are present in the bride's adornment. So if we return to the wedding, which I started with, we see that the bride is dressed outside. It may not be so obvious from these photographs, but she sits outside of her house. So it's very public. People can come and watch. You can hear the songs being sung in her honor from far away. One woman brushes, as you see in the top left, the bride's long hair using large, deliberate strokes, and she brushes a very sweet-smelling herb within her hair called rihan. And women told me that the thickness and the length of the bride's hair is a direct reflection of her potential fertility and the number of children that she may have. And her brush really absorbs the essence of her reproductive power. And women also told me that if a bride wants to get pregnant, immediately she will ask to use the brush that was used to style her hair during her wedding because it will induce pregnancy. And women who don't want to get pregnant, they say, keep that brush away. I don't want to see it. So, and you can see that from this particular headdress that, from this particular photograph on the right, that the headdress is sewn around the edges of her head. Right here, they're sewing with needle and thread, right, to sew it shut. So she can sort of see through the fabric, but not really well. And I interpret this action as representing the symbolic control of female sexuality, both from the evil eye and then also from harmful forces that might jeopardize her ability to have children. So it's known that jealous people at a wedding could maybe go and do something to harm the bride so that the wedding cannot be consummated and maybe she won't have children. And also, there's a lot of social anxiety that surrounds female sexuality during transitional life phases such as this. The color red carries a very potent meaning. Women often use red wool to weave protective motifs on textiles, even those created for their fathers, their husbands, and their sons. For example, in the Sirwa Mountains, Amazigh men wore a hooded cape called an aknif. And this was woven from dark brown or black wool and decorated with a long elliptical design that's woven in red, which is typically interpreted as a protective eye motif. Now, these particular capes, they exist in museum collections all over the world, and they're really a very distinct item of male attire. And they're mentioned by early travelers to Morocco, from the 19th century. They're made from very heavy goat and sheep wool, and this was actually woven in one piece. So a woman would start with the hood, so starting at the top, and then weave the rest of the piece, moving her loom and making it wider as she goes. So there was a French missionary who traveled in Morocco in the area, Amazigh area where these are made, and he says that these were made, they flourished. This was in 1883. And then 40 years later, Jean Besancenot, who I mentioned earlier, who traveled in the 1930s to Morocco, noted that they were rarely made anymore because of the amount of labor that was required to construct one. So these faded from popularity. So Besancenot also photographed a Jewish man wearing an akanif. And Amazigh men, we know, wore this with the design facing outwards. And this man is actually wearing it inside out to indicate that he is Jewish. Men in Morocco no longer wear the cape, as I said, but they continue to be woven for the tourist industry. And female weavers, as you can see, not only included the large oculus, but from here we can see that there's a lot of very fine geometric designs that are also included, done with a tapestry weaving technique. So these motifs resemble greenish-blue geometric designs that women commonly tattooed on their bodies. Women tattooed their faces, their hands, the ankles of an Amazigh girl when she reached puberty. And so tattoos were really important symbols that a girl was of a marriageable age. So given the fact that tattoo and textile motifs resembled each other, one can deduce that both of the arts are gendered symbols of women's creative powers. But why would women do this? Why would they want to tattoo on their bodies symbols that resemble those that they weave on their textiles, or even those that they paint onto ceramics? So if we look in detail at some of the motifs, we can find the answer, I believe. So there's a close-up of a textile from the Middle Atlas region from central Morocco, and you can see the designs on this are typical of Amazigh textiles across northern Africa. There are zigzags that are very common. There is a diamond motif here and here. So the zigzag is said by women to represent a saw or a sickle that can pop and burst the evil eye. The diamond is said to be a mirror or an eye itself that can deflect the negative energy of the evil eye. And then you also see a series of triangles here at the bottom. So the triangles are very, very common. They're found in the fibula, the jewelry that we talked about earlier. And people disagree, scholars, about how and why this shared visual vocabulary developed. The scholar Belle Prussin, who I mentioned earlier, she attributed the triangular form in particular to the symbolic importance of the number 3. And she says this is an important number in Jewish popular belief, so she pushed the idea and supported the idea that Jewish artisans had a profound impact on the prevalence of the triangular shape in Amazigh art. Other scholars interpret the triangle as deriving from Phoenician times and connecting it, as you see on the right, to the representation of Tanit, who is here. So this is a Phoenician stela, a burial marker that dates from the 1st century BC from Tunisia. And so people will say this is also the shape of a pubis, and it's meant to represent female fertility. And perhaps before Islam, Amazigh women may have been worshiping female gods. This is one of the suggestions that you sometimes hear. Also, there's a scholar named James Bynon who talked about this image that you see on the left. He argued that probably a lot of the Amazigh motifs developed during Roman times, and that it's very common in Roman mosaics to find references to protection from the evil eye. So here we've got an eye with the spear going through it, and then all of the creatures surrounding this eye are creatures with sharp points. So there's a scorpion, there is a tiger, there's some antelope with sharp horns, there's a tiger. So all of these things can pop and burst the evil eye. So he would say most of them are protection from that. But can we really make a connection between these ancient symbols and contemporary Amazigh art? So the inability to historicize Amazigh motifs is largely due to the paucity of archaeological work that's done in North Africa. Archaeologists have begun to ask these questions. There's an archaeologist named Abdullah Fili who did an excavation in the 14th century Quranic school located in the Moroccan city of Fez. And what he found is that there were the presence of ceramics from the 14th century traded from Spain, which we expected, into Fez. But also he found that there were rural ceramics that were found in the middle of this Quranic school. And these rural ceramics had the same consistency and also the same decoration of designs that you find in Amazigh ceramics today. So there appears to have been a connection then, or an artistic vision or artistic style that was associated with rural Amazigh people that developed as early as the 14th century that has continued into the present. So an increase in archaeological work would reveal more information about the development of Amazigh art through the centuries. So women even constructed these necklaces that they often made for themselves, with this idea of protection against the evil eye and from harm into account. So they often use small silver pendants. So here you can see that there's a hand. And then here you can see that there's a three-pronged pendant here. So the sharp points could possibly pop and burst the evil eye. This is from Algeria, from the Kabyle area, once again. And what's really fascinating about it is that this woven band at the top where the silver pendants are attached are made from cloves and also coral beads. So cloves have a very pleasant smell. They're also believed to be an aphrodisiac. And this would have been worn by a woman on her wedding night to enhance her fertility and not to impede her having children. So the arts are multisensory, and of course clove has a very nice smell to it. Henna also has a very distinct smell and is used during ceremonial occasions such as weddings. So covering one's hand with cool, moist henna increased the intensity of the ceremonial occasion and also beautified the body. So women believe that henna contains positive healing power due to its association with baraka, or divine blessing. So henna is said to be good when you put it on your skin, for your bones, for your eyes, of course for your hair. The Prophet Muhammad was said to have used henna. So people really love to use henna. It's considered to be a very blessed material. So further protection you can see not only comes from the henna, but this woman also has a wool string that is placed between all of her fingers, binding her fingers together. And so this is a bride, and the idea is that when she goes to meet her husband, he will undo the threads and consummate the marriage afterwards. So the idea is that these threads protected her. They sort of locked her up and blocked any kind of evil harm or influence, and protected her from jealous individuals who might try to use supernatural means to prohibit her from consummating the marriage. So henna is also used to decorate textiles that are worn by the bride. This textile from the central Anti-Atlas region of Morocco will be placed on a bride's head before the wedding. What's interesting about this is that it would be completely covered. So it's dyed with henna, placed on her head, and then her entire head would be covered with a red silk scarf. So you wouldn't even see this. So it's really meant to be more protective than decorative. So another ritual that clearly defines the connection between the bride and fertility is something called the Bride of the Rain. Once or twice a year, an Amazigh woman or Amazigh women used to gather together. This is very rarely performed today. And they would dress a ladle up as a bride. And they carry it through the streets, singing songs and collecting food, sugar, tea, different things that they could have a party with. And they would take the bride, they'd sing songs in honor of the rain and asking God to send rain, and then they'll take the bride and they'll turn her upside down into a dried riverbed. So hopes that this would induce rain to fall. Actually, this was staged for me. Well, it was recreated. I wouldn't say totally staged. It was recreated on my request for me because it's very rarely held today within Morocco. People criticize it as anti-Islamic because it represents worshiping a false god. And when I did this, it actually rained. So you can see that there are dark clouds up there. So it worked, and we had a blast. It was so fun. Everyone was singing and dancing through the streets. And the story that's often told about this is that these are called Tizlin Anzar. So that means bride of the rain. But Anzar is also the name of an ancient rain god. And there's a story that people tell in Algeria that Amazigh people tell, that Anzar saw a girl bathing by a stream and fell in love with her and wanted to marry her, but she refused. Who's going to marry the rain, right? So he caused everything to dry up. A drought happened. People were suffering. They begged her, please, please marry Anzar. She agreed, and in the end, rain fell. And so this is the story of the bride of Anzar, the bride of the rain. So, like I said, this has largely faded from existence. Tattoos have also largely faded from existence. It's rare to see anyone but an elderly woman in tattoos today in Northern Africa, because tattoos are believed to permanently alter God's perfect creation and also get in the way when people are washing for prayer. So they're not appropriate to have anymore. So throughout this talk, I have asserted that wedding ceremonies serve as one of the few occasions when Amazigh women continue to wear textiles and jewelry that are associated with their ancestors. Now, it'd be easy for me to end this lecture with the comment that celebrates women as conservators of Amazigh visual traditions, but I want to complicate this a little bit. At the same time that a woman is the center of an Amazigh wedding, the bride's face is completely covered in a cloth. Her waist is bound by a belt. Her hands are covered with protective henna. Her fingers are bound with a wool thread. And I interpret these actions as symbolically controlling female sexuality. Wedding arts express fertility, but also its containment. So weddings are a time when sexuality and reproduction obviously are very central concerns, and they're essential to the continuation of the Amazigh people into the future. And so women who become wives and mothers, they're very much respected within Amazigh societies, and they gain considerable prestige. But those women who don't, those women who are divorced, who are infertile, they often have lower status. So wedding rituals have been very slow to change because they reinforce societal desires to preserve themselves, to continue into the future. And Amazigh identity, which relies on women in the control of female fertility, right? So they continue to maintain these arts. So in the last few decades, most Amazigh women have sold the silver jewelry and the amber necklaces of their mothers and their grandmothers to collectors or tourists, preferring to wear gold jewelry. And during an occasion of a wedding, women scramble to find the jewelry and the textiles that they need to dress the bride. So they borrow pieces from different people so that they can have the appropriate wedding attire. And in the last several decades, rapid urbanization and the increase of the influence of the Arabic language and, of course, desertification have profoundly impacted daily lives. However, women continue to carry Amazigh arts into the future. Although a woman may make textile for tourists, she may speak Arabic to her neighbors. She still continues to teach her daughters and her granddaughters how to weave. She recreates motifs that date back to at least the 14th century, if not earlier. These are motifs associated with fertility and protection. Amazigh have managed to preserve a distinct visual aesthetic that extends from Morocco in the west to the Siwa oasis in Egypt. And at its heart are the visual arts born from the hands of women. Thank you. So I'm happy to take questions.
How did you get interested in the Amazigh women to begin with?
I studied African art, and not very many people were working in Northern Africa, but I also have a background in archaeology. And I had participated in an excavation in southeastern Morocco at a site called Sidi Massa, which is a stopping point for caravans crossing the Sahara. I went to Sidi Massa to work and became fascinated with what I saw, Amazigh art, and went back, sort of switched my topic from West Africa into North Africa and decided to do research on the topic. It's really wonderful because you do, as a woman, it's been very, almost, I wouldn't say easy, but it's easier to become part of the community because it is so female-centered. There's a question in the back.
As an archaeologist, have you done work with the caves in the Sahara where there are images of women that date from about 6,000 BC, I believe? And do they have anything to do with the Amazigh women?
I wouldn't consider myself an archaeologist. I was just doing some archaeology. So I'm not sure. I'm not really familiar with these caves. So could you tell me more about them?
I believe they're in the Atlas Mountains, some of them, and they're not very old, obviously, compared to the French and the Spanish caves, but there are several that have women displayed, and they are actually quite decorated. They wear caps, and they have jewelry. They're wearing jewelry, and I'm just wondering if that might correspond somehow to the silver.
I have not heard of the caves, but I'm really going to check it out because I'm very fascinated by that. So thank you for telling me about it. But I mean, the Amazigh have been in North Africa since at least 6,000 BC, if not earlier. I mean, they are the indigenous people of North Africa. So I wouldn't be surprised if there was a connection there. And I do think as more archaeological work is done, we will find out more information. So this excavation that I mentioned of the 14th century site, it was the courtyard of a Quranic school, and everyone was really surprised to find that there were Amazigh ceramics there, because it's always been considered to be an Arab city. The founder of the city in 800 AD moved from the Middle East and moved into settle in that city. But there's also a story, he also married an Amazigh woman. So Amazigh were there. They were there when the Romans were there. And so I'm sure that we will find out more information about the history of their culture as more work is done. So I will definitely look at those caves. Thank you.
Perhaps I'm not correct, but it is my recollection that the Berbers were a nomadic group. And if so, how did they carry on the art with these big, heavy looms in a nomadic culture?
Some were nomadic, some were settled. The loom is actually not very heavy. So it's just a couple of beams. I've seen photographs, and I've even seen women pick them up and tie them onto their backs and walk with them. So they're very easy to move around. And there's always a donkey. You can put the loom on the back of your donkey, right? So, women are in charge of weaving the tents. So I didn't talk about that, but they weave them on ground looms. And so they weave one panel at a time. And so usually they'll spend 1 year weaving one panel, and then they will use that to replace one of the old panels. And women are in charge of putting up the tent, taking it down, and the loom is part of that. So the loom can be inside the tent, it can be outside. But some people settled down. There's a very old tradition of adobe architecture. And Matmata, that I mentioned before, where Star Wars was filmed, was actually, people were living in pits under the ground. So do you know the scene of inside the bar? There's that scene. That is inside one of those pits. So when you go to Matmata, you don't see anything from the surface. People are completely living underground. They've literally dug houses into the ground. So, and this is done for protection, so people can't see that they're there. And the government in recent years has tried to resettle some of them into villages above ground, but some people, and it's also cooler, it's the desert. So people have been settled for a long time as well as being nomadic. Everything you ever wanted to know? Any pressing questions? Yes, Barbara.
Yeah, on these wedding images, the jewelry seemed to be aluminum. Is that right? That contemporary, because it looked like also the bracelets looked rather like aluminum than like.
No, they're silver, but
Not
it's
these
mixed.
Old ones. Yeah, I think one of the first ones.
Yeah, we'll go
okay.
there. No, it's definitely, they're very heavy.
And one of the chain she was wearing also, it seemed like aluminum. So I was wondering if, because
This
in Western
one.
Africa you have that very often.
And this one. No, I mean, no, they're very heavy. They're not 100%, they're not sterling silver. So silver with a little bit of copper mixed in and some other materials, but they're silver. They're definitely not aluminum. They're heavy. So even the fibula themselves are silver. The amber is actually very light. It looks very heavy, but amber floats. So if you have real amber, it's very light to wear. Now there's a tradition of making these bracelets with the points out of gold. They're not quite as large, but some people like to wear those instead.
I wanted to make a comment and then ask a question.
Yes.
My comment to confirm your idea of things moving from Africa south of the Sahara north. The locks of the Dogon and the Malian are very typical locks of granary doors, and we actually found one in southern Morocco, simplified without figures, but those traditions obviously did move north. You mentioned the Tuareg as part of the Amazigh, and I was wondering whether they really the Tuareg women partake in similar ways. One knows certainly the silver work that the Tuareg men do. But would you comment on that, or has that moved south out of your area?
No, it's fine. So the first issue is the idea of influence moving south to north or north to south, usually when you see people writing about Islam in Africa or the trans-Saharan connection, they usually start in the north and then they talk about how Islam crossed the Sahara and profoundly influenced people in sub-Saharan Africa, starting with the creation of mosques and also textiles. Many textile influences went from North Africa to West Africa. I could have given in a paper just about textile similarities between the Amazigh textiles and those found in Mali today. They have very similar motifs. But the way of creating and weaving is very different in West Africa. It's men and very different types of looms. Strip weaving instead of weaving on the vertical loom. So this is a very unusual to see things moving or to at least conceptualize things in this way. And I think we need to do this more, see things move from south to north, because obviously it happened. And you're right, granary doors are very similar. And this is another example of a type of art that was developed early by people who were more sedentary versus nomadic. So there are some areas of northern Africa where Amazigh who were moving, they would have built entire structures just to hold their grain that they had harvested. And the doors would be wooden that look like the doors that you find in Mali, with the same locks, except the ones in North Africa don't have the figurative decoration on the surface, yes. So, who influenced who? Was it just because they both have the same function? We don't know. But those same locks, I've been to Mali and seen those in Dogon areas. The locks that they'll use on granary doors are the same locks that they'll use in southern Morocco and Algeria. So the granary, the tradition of building these magnificent granaries is really old. They're very beautiful in North Africa. And, there'll be, when I talk about a granary, imagine that there are 100 small rooms all in a circle, and every family has one small room that holds their grain. And then there's one person who guards all of the granary, and then they'll show up and take the grain as they need it. And as far as Tuareg goes, women do control the tent in Tuareg societies. Women have a lot of power and status. When a woman, the tent is made out of leather in the Tuareg areas as opposed to wool. So they make them out of goat skins that are sewn together. And they're usually dyed kind of this orange reddish color. When a woman has a daughter, she starts to save up goat skins. And then, as she gets older and some of her children are married, she starts taking the skins down from her own tent and using them to make the tent that she will then give to her daughter when her daughter is married. So it's a really beautiful symbol, I think, of a woman's tent becoming very large when she has her family, when she's a young mother, and then it gets smaller as her children grow up and she gives them things. I think it's a beautiful image. And women own this tent. They take it with them to their husbands' homes, and the husband actually moves and lives near the wife's family for a while. And then after a year or so, they move closer to his family. But it's so to make the transition for women easier after marriage, so that they're not just uprooted completely and move far away from everything that they know. So there's definitely similarities between jewelry styles of Tuareg and ideas concerning womanhood and the Amazigh in North Africa.
Maybe I can just add something about when you talked about the locks and the difference in design between the locks in southern Morocco and in Mali. The question to ask actually is what influenced or just why? And I would just say, okay, if we get to take a look back in time and just see when Islam came to Africa, it started actually in North Africa, and it did not go to sub-Saharan Africa until it spread in North Africa. So this means that Islam has actually influenced the designs that were put or applied on the arts. So Islam basically, or in the Muslim world, people do not put images, right? Like in the Dogon country or arts, you would find figures, right? And that's okay. But in the northern parts of North Africa or of Africa, you don't see those figures. That's because simply Islam says, or Muslims do not put figures or pictures of humans on the arts. And I think right there is a connection in not having figures or images on the locks in southern Morocco versus having them in sub-Saharan Africa. But eventually, it started to even get reduced in sub-Saharan Africa, comparing it to the past, because also they became Muslims later. So just to point out that's a
Thanks for adding
religious influence.
It's true. This is why many of the motifs are very stylized, even though they may represent things from nature, like a hand. You don't want to represent things in a three-dimensional way, so it becomes more stylized. Sometimes people interpret the triangle as being a hand, a stylized hand.
Thank you very much. I think there are no more questions. Thank you all for coming, and thank you, Cynthia, for this really interesting lecture.
Thank you.